To each of you in turn. So if you could keep it quite brief, because we've got a lot of people. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to a Blavatnik What's in the News session. We could rename these seminars Shock of the Week seminars. So we are here to contemplate the Trump era. The way we're going to do this is that I'm going to start by saying a few words about how I think one can see and analyze this and how to think about how a Trump presidency and a Republican Congress may proceed. And then we're going to have my four colleagues here, Sarah Faroukui, have I pronounced it correctly? Yes. Ali Kelly, Farid Osmanov, and Jonathan Padilla to talk about how it looks from the point of view of different regions of the world, what to expect and how their regions may change the way they do things in the light of this outcome. And then, of course, we open up to questions. So how should we think about this vote? Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind when we think about any election, as in Brexit, we talk about 52 versus 48 point something. In this case, we have to remember that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College, so lost the election. But this is a sign of a very divided vote in the United States. It's not a sign of majority anger, if you like. It's a sign that an enormous number of people who, in opinion polls, said that they disliked, even possibly hated Donald Trump, but nevertheless voted for him because they preferred him to the alternative and because they felt that he was symbolically anti-system, anti-establishment, whereas Hillary Clinton, 25 plus years at the center of American politics, was inescapably, I think, or at least anyway, unescaped representative of the mainstream of the establishment. Second point we note is that this is a Republican Party success, even despite not really having a Republican candidate. In other words, the securing of the Senate and maintaining of a solid majority in the House of Representatives is an important success for the Republicans, a defeat for the Democratic Party. And so Donald Trump in the White House will have, for at least his first 2 years, a Republican majority in both houses of Congress. One has to emphasize 2 years because midterm elections typically change things after the first 2 years of a presidency, but nevertheless, for 2 years we will have a nominally Republican in the White House, but anyway, a Donald Trump in the White House because he defines himself, but a Republican Congress. Third, is this unparalleled? Is this something that is somehow the inconceivable becoming the reality? Well, I think we, in thinking about it, need to remember two historical or parallels, one distant and one recent. The American historical parallel is William Jennings Bryan in the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement that he led didn't win the presidency. But while he ran 3 times for the presidency and lost, nevertheless, he had actually a significant impact on policy. And Teddy Roosevelt and President Taft, if I got it right, implemented in that period quite a substantial number of major reforms that did reflect that populist movement, particularly antitrust legislation, but also others. And in a certain sense, Teddy Roosevelt's principle of carrying a big stick might be a parallel to how to think about Donald Trump, I would say. Second parallel is a recent parallel, is a European parallel, and that is Silvio Berlusconi, elected in Italy first in 1994, but then more powerfully in 2001 and again in 2008. Silvio Berlusconi is really the predecessor in modern times of Donald Trump, a businessman, enters politics from left field, basically forms his own movement, comes in with massive conflicts of interest in his case, a lot of lawsuits outstanding against him, and indeed subsequently, Donald Trump now, according to one newspaper that I saw this morning, has 70 open lawsuits against him and his businesses. Most particularly about Silvio Berlusconi that we have to recognize is that Silvio Berlusconi was an incessant campaigner who distrusted everyone, was in some sense, strange sense, a gilded member of society, a billionaire businessman who nevertheless painted himself as the champion of the little guy, of the power. He celebrated the power of victimhood, his own victimhood and that of others, and used it very successfully. The lessons of Berlusconi in Italy and in Europe for Trump, and thinking about Trump, are first what we surely already all should recognize, which is the error of underestimating a figure of that sort. Constantly with Silvio Berlusconi, it was assumed that he couldn't last, that he would be finished very quickly, that he would, this scandal or that thing would finish him off. He only now is in decline in Italian politics, more than 20 years after he entered it. So second, the point I've said already, the power of even gilded, even privileged victimhood by portraying himself as the victim of the Italian establishment, particularly the judicial system. Actually, he maintained his popularity as the representative of the little guy, even as he failed to deliver over many years. So, and then third, as I've said, the power of continual campaigning. Someone who will get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and tweet is not someone you can expect to take a back seat and fail to campaign. Donald Trump will be a daily campaigner throughout his presidency, just as Silvio Berlusconi was, and he will seek to, if you like, communicate directly with what he sees as his audience and his supporters, just as Silvio Berlusconi used to do. So, what to expect from Trump and from Congress? What are, to borrow Rumsfeld, the known knowns, when in a situation where there are so many known unknowns, since there is no such thing as a Trump plan or a Trump ideology or Trumpism that we know. So what can we depend upon? And then we'll open out to see what my colleagues here think. First, I think we can be pretty sure that Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, will be repealed very quickly, because it's one element on which Trump's promises and the Republican Congress's desires coincide. The only thing to say against that is that if you repeal something, you tend to have something to put in its place. There may be complications in deciding what to do in the vacuum left by a repeal of Obamacare, but nevertheless, we can expect that to go. Second, there's a Supreme Court vacancy waiting to be filled. We can be sure that Barack Obama's nominee will not be accepted, and that a nominee acceptable to the Republicans will be put there. So the balance of the Supreme Court will, in this first instance, go more to the conservative side. Third, looking at his economic policies and economic situation, the background to which should be that a new president in this situation should always be assumed to be a man who focuses essentially on domestic affairs, first of all, to the extent that he can, rather than looking out to the world. Bill Clinton even did that in 1992, 93, so I think we can expect that from Donald Trump. Two realities will face him. One is that he and the Republican Congress are different on fiscal policy. He is a big spender. In his plans, he's proposed big spending. In his victory speech, he proposed infrastructure spending. He's proposed huge tax cuts as well, but anyway, he's a big fiscal spender, whereas the dominant Republican trend in Congress is fiscal conservatism, and indeed Paul Ryan, his most powerful counterpart, is famously conservative. So there will be an interplay, a battle between those two, in which at first Donald Trump, as the victor, will have the upper hand, but Congress always has the final say. Second, he is in a rising economy where jobs are being created, unemployment is falling, and earnings are increasing. Too late to obviously change the result this week, but he is not in an economic crisis. That means that you can assume that he can dump trade negotiations that are not yet ratified and not yet concluded. So Trans-Pacific Partnership is dead. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was probably already dying, but now is definitively dead. That's not of any interest to him. NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, he has obviously campaigned on the proposition of repealing it. I would expect that he might carry that through, but what you can expect for sure is that he will treat it as a bargaining tool with Mexico and Canada. That he, as a deal maker, will see NAFTA as being something he can get rid of because he said it's useless and the most terrible trade deal ever contemplated. But secondly, he's a deal maker and he thinks he's got to do some kind of deal with Mexico over immigration. There's some leverage there. So that's going to be the question about that policy. Next, climate change. What limited executive order-based policies that President Obama has done to take part in international accords, the Paris Agreement and so forth, I think we can be sure that Trump and Congress will abandon those because he can easily cancel an executive order. Then we move, I would say, into international affairs, which is the agenda for my four colleagues here. But in putting that question to them, I would say that if one looks at Donald Trump and says how much should one worry about the Trump era, what should one think about it, I would say that in terms of his basic agenda, whether one agrees with it or not, it just needs to be played out, and we'll see it through the US constitutional system and the US politics and so forth. But the real issue is how does Donald Trump, someone like Donald Trump, someone with his attitudes and background, how does he deal with crises? So the big tests on the economy will be when the next recession hits. How does he deal with an economic crisis and rising unemployment? That, to me, is when the trade protectionism issue will become live much more than it will be after January the 26th. Similarly, military crises, foreign policy crises, those are the big questions about a Trump presidency. How will he respond to a crisis in Syria, in Ukraine, in the South China Sea, anywhere else in the world? What would his attitudes be? So, let's see what we all think. Sarah, shall we start with you?
Thank you, Bill. So, again, when I wanted to be a part of this panel, I was very excited because I knew a lot of what I'm going to say about a Clinton administration and her policies in South Asia. And then last evening, I had a bit of a panic attack because I had no idea where Trump stood on a lot of his policies in the region. And luckily for me, I don't think Trump does either. So, again, I'm going to quickly just look at what some of his key policy points or some of his key points have been with respect to a few specific countries, and then just wrap it up on, again, 2 or 3 points with respect to his anti-immigration and anti-free trade and things like that. So with respect to China, what's interesting is that in one of his speeches, he's talked about trade wars with China, and that's America's biggest trade partner. He's promised to slap punitive tariffs of 45% on Chinese good. It's a great statement, very bold, very abrasive, but again, I wasn't able to find out how or why he's going to do that. On the campaign trail, he's also hinted that he threatened to pull US troops out of Beijing's regional rivals, which is Japan and South Korea, but he's kept quiet on some of the key security challenges in the region, which include South China Sea, cybersecurity, North Korea, though he did promise to have a dialogue with Kim Jong-un, though the North Korean administration itself did not take this quite seriously. With Japan, he's hinted to withdraw 47,000 US troops from Japan and other 28,500 from the border that separates North and South Korea. He said that Japan and Seoul have benefited from US security for too long. If someone attacks Japan, we have to start World War III, okay? If we get attacked, it doesn't have to help us. That was his statement on security with respect to Japan and China. And one of the most alarming points that have come up is, again, his suggestion that Japan and South Korea should end their dependence on the US nuclear umbrella and instead develop their own nuclear deterrence. And this could basically spark an Asia-Pacific arms race. With respect to India, now I find this very interesting being an Indian myself. Trump has said that he would be, I quote, best friends with India. He would also look forward to deepening the, I quote again, diplomatic and military cooperation that is shared interest of both countries. He's called India a natural ally, appreciated India for being a great friend in the war against radical Islamic terrorism. Again, wonderful rhetoric. It makes me feel very good, but once you try to delve into any of these statements, there's nothing tangible or concrete as to what the basis of this friendship would be. And again, India-US ties have strengthened over the last 2 to 4 years under the Obama administration and the Modi administration. But beyond these very friendly statements, nothing concrete has come through from what Trump would basically do. Again, the pivot to Asia policy, which was one of the primary policies of Obama, again, that is something that's going to be under threat for a very, very long time. And again, issues such as climate change, such as ties with China, these are things that I mean, it's all rhetorical statements, but nothing that I can delve deeply into or take very seriously. So again, while I can say we don't know a lot, we do know 3 things about Trump's policies, which is A, he's anti-free trade, B, he's anti-immigration, 3, he's anti-Muslim. And the ramifications of each of these antis is going to play out, I think, the most in Asia, because the Asian economy, again, both the sides, the Asian countries, the bilateral relations, a lot of it is dependent on these 3. So with that...
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. We'll come to question, and I would just, as a frame, say that the key question is the gap between campaign policies and what people might do. I remember having an Australian foreign minister visit once who talked about some things that they were going to do, and they were a complete contradiction to campaign policies that promises he'd been done the previous 6 months previously. And we said, what about your campaign promises? And he said, there are core promises and there are other promises. So we have to try to focus on core promises. Ali.
So I'm going to be speaking from a European perspective, and in particular from the perspective of the European Union. So obviously we can't really predict what Trump is going to do, but I think that I want to make 2 points. First, that Trump's, I guess his mercantilist attitude towards both security and trade really threatens EU's position in the world, and he promises to kind of shake up the global order, where the status quo, where European and US transatlantic preferences have really had quite a privileged position for a long time. And secondly, I want to talk kind of more generally about how the populist forces that brought Trump to power are being seen more and more in Europe at the moment, and I think are probably the single biggest threat to the European integration at the moment. Well, before I get into that, just as kind of an aside, I want to just reiterate what you both mentioned about climate change and how these populist forces may pose an existential threat to the EU, but his climate change policy poses an existential threat to planet Earth and life on planet Earth as we know it. He said that climate change is a Chinese hoax. He's decided to get rid of the EPA. And there's a very low likelihood now that the Paris Climate Treaty will be enforced given there's a Republican Congress and Senate. So I think that in our world of collective action problems, these isolationist and nationalistic preferences really pose a great threat. But anyway, from more of a European perspective, in relation to security, he wants kind of less intervention in Europe, and he's been very critical of European states free riding on NATO. And I think his whole attitude towards diplomacy is it's about winning, to the victor go the spoils. And I don't think he really appreciates that diplomacy can mean, long negotiations, very unsatisfying compromises. And if he wants to maintain an international order with the US at the apex, that means sacrificing national preferences in different situations. In relation to trade, as you mentioned, the TPP and TTIP are probably both dead. He said it's the worst deal he's ever seen. And I think this too also doesn't really show that he sees the broader picture of keeping the balance of power, and how transatlantic preferences have kind of set the rules of global trade for a long time, and how TTP and TTIP have been kind of designed to counterbalance the rise of emerging economies such as China. And the fact that he doesn't really see the political significance of these trade deals it is quite worrying from a European perspective, I think. And in relation to kind of just populist, right-wing, isolationist politics in general, I think we've seen this, in France with the Front National, in Austria, Hungary, and Poland as well. And I think, now we have Brexit on the one hand, and the fact that, France and Germany are very much central to the core European Union. And now we have the presidential elections coming up in France next year. Le Pen, I think the whole idea that we're continually surprised and the elite can't predict Brexit, we can't predict the rise of Trump. I think we have to be a bit more humble and realise that Le Pen and the Front National pose a very real threat, that they could quite easily win the presidential election next year. And Marine Le Pen aligns with Trump on a number of issues, so she's anti-NATO, very Islamophobic and isolationist, and anti-globalization. And I think the EU institutions up until this point have kind of been sheltered somewhat from this extreme right-wing politics because they're not particularly democratic themselves, but the effects are really being seen more and more in the member states. So I think what we might see is a change of where the traditional political cleavages are in Europe. So the traditional left and right in France may have to join together, the Parti Socialiste and the Républicains, to counteract the rise of the extreme right. So we might see now a centrist versus extremes as opposed to traditional left and right. I think those are my predictions.
Very good. Well, absolutely. Well, now, Farid, on to you. Are you going to talk about Russia as part of your thoughts?
I'm gonna cover Central Asia.
Central Asia.
All the way to Eastern Europe, South
Yes.
Caucasus,
Oh, good.
post-Soviet
Okay.
space.
Excellent.
That's our plan.
Excellent. That's go ahead.
Yeah, as all other panelists, I believe, and everyone else in this room, I was caught in surprise seeing Trump become a president, and also for the sake of this panel, when I was preparing for it, I was actually also thinking more about what I'm gonna talk about, like Hillary Clinton and her policy towards the region, which would be more predictable, I believe. With Trump, we definitely cannot possibly know how exactly his policy will be built and what will be the main tenets and main elements of this policy towards the region that I'm going to cover now. So let's start with Central Asia. This is, I believe, one of the most strategically important regions for the United States, which was not so well designed in terms of U.S. foreign policy for the last 20, maybe 25 years after the post-Soviet Soviet states gained independence after 1991. But after 9/11 and NATO operation in Afghanistan, the importance of this region has been progressively rising. And during Hillary Clinton as a Secretary of State, this region gained even more importance because she was quite active in her foreign policy making for the region. She initiated such initiatives as New Silk Road, for example, in 2011, which was aimed to boost connectivity and economic integration in the region, because Central Asia is one of the least economically integrated regions in the world, and the economic development and progress of this region is amplified in the light of Afghanistan problem. So if Afghanistan, if this region is not taken care of, basically, there is a high risk that extremist movements will transcend the borders, and it may cause a big headache for the West. With Donald Trump, I believe that the odds are high that the region might be forgotten altogether, unfortunately, given his attitude towards foreign policy and his talks, his points about that U.S. should cut military spending, that U.S. should be disengaged from many regions of the world. And I think that given the past history and unpopularity of the Central Asia in terms of U.S. foreign policy making, this is highly probable. And given also the problems that we have now in the Middle East and other regions of the world, indeed, we may see declining interest of the U.S. towards Central Asia. And that might be very alarming, especially in terms of, in the light of this situation, worsening situation in Afghanistan in recent years, with Taliban becoming more active and basically Afghan national security forces losing control that was so hard to establish in the last 14 years due to help of NATO and NATO operation. Now, if we can move a bit towards the east to countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, there are huge commercial interests of the Western oil and gas companies in these countries, including those of the United States. So the main point for these countries and what they expect from the United States is boost of further partnership with these countries. And that is especially important in the light of the relations of these countries with Russia. Because all the major deals that were signed in this region, in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, they were signed in 1990s when Russia was at its weakest point. So it didn't have resources, it couldn't have the ability to put some sticks in the wheels at that time. But now with Russia, more powerful, more, let's say, aggressive, that may be a huge question if the oil contracts, the gas contracts, and bringing resources from the east to the west might be actually viable. So I think that, but as far as Donald Trump is concerned, I don't see why he should oppose it. I think he's, given his background in business, he actually may come to terms, maybe, and given his good, potentially good relations with Russia, maybe, he can come to terms as far as this oil and gas contracts are concerned. We'll see. Turkmenistan is an interesting country, being one of the having one of the largest gas reserves in the world. Now they run the pipeline to China, gas pipeline, and I think for the West and for the US, it would be very important to have another pipeline running to the West, not to the East. And in this regard, Trans-Caspian pipeline, which was stalled for many years, this is a project which was stalled for many years because of the interference of Russia and impossibility to delineate Caspian Sea. So I think this is a huge point. If the United States and the West may give further support to the project, this will have crucial impact on Russia, because from the point of view of how Russia uses its oil and gas reserves as a political tool and pressurizes Europe, if this project is going to happen, if the United States will boost this project, will give more political support to the project, this may actually weaken Russia, strategic stance of the Russia in the region. And then projects like TANAP and TAP, which are set to be commissioned in 2018, they must be given further support, and I don't see also here why Trump should not do that. So I think Hillary Clinton and Trump would be more or less on the same page as far as commercial deals and strategic boost of the region is concerned. Just one point, for so-called frozen conflicts, I think that's a very important point in the region. In the post-Soviet space, we have conflicts in Azerbaijan, in Georgia, in Ukraine, and Moldova. And I think that the most important thing for the foreign policy making of the United States and Donald Trump would be to give equal treatment to all of these conflicts, because in some cases we see like supporting territorial integrity of some states while disregarding territorial integrity of other states. I believe that all four regions are crucial. All four regions have the similar problem that has to be dealt with, and they should be given equal treatment.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to this core relations with Russia and with China, and this question of whether or not, how friendly Trump could be with Russia, especially given, I would say, the fact that the Republicans in Congress, and indeed some of those who are at least tipped to come into his administration, are old cold warriors. So how friendly can you be with Russia if you have John Bolton as National Security Advisor, for example? Just a thought. Anyway, Jonathan.
So I'll preface by a few things. First, I'm actually not from Latin America, although some of my Latin American colleagues have asked me to fill in for this capacity. I am an American, but I am Mexican-American, so my grandparents immigrated from Mexico to the United States about 100 years ago. So when looking about Latin America, I think it's important to think about this in several ways. I think first off, we can talk briefly about immigration and how that impacts directly the United States and Latin American countries. There are over 56 million individuals of Hispanic descent in the United States. The largest majority of those is Mexican American, but we have very, very large populations from Central and South America in the eastern United States, including Florida and onto the Northeast. There's a lot of tension there with these communities, and there's a lot of fear. I was on the phone with a dear friend on Wednesday morning. He's in Puerto Rico, which is a part of the United States, contrary to what a lot of people believe. And he was saying that he had a real fear about the relationship between the United States and the island of Puerto Rico. And probably more importantly, his daughter had come up to him that morning and said, you know, Daddy, can we move to Japan? Because I'm afraid. And she's a very sweet girl, and it's very sad for me to know that she's thinking those types of things. So immigration is going to be a critical issue, and we've already seen Trump promise throughout the campaign that he wants to deport millions upon millions of people. Moreover, he wants to build a wall along the southern United States border and have Mexico pay for it, perhaps through a tax, through remittances. So there's a number of issues there that are very disconcerting to Hispanic populations of the United States. And frankly, it's going to cause a lot of turmoil, both domestically and internationally, if the Trump administration, the Republican Congress attempt to go through this. For the last 8 years, the White House and Congress have been unable to come to any semblance of comprehensive immigration reform. Facebook's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, put together an organization called Forward.us, which has basically been a very, very well-funded organization designed to kind of move comprehensive reform through the Congress, building bridges with both Republicans and Democrats. And even with that kind of alliance in place, nothing's been done. So I would say there probably is going to be no movement on immigration in terms of reform that we saw in, say, 1986 under President Reagan, which was the last major reform of immigration in our system. And if anything, it's dangerous in the sense that you will likely see more draconian measures that came out in 2005, 2006 from Wisconsin Congressman James Sensenbrenner, who put forward some really, really dark laws that were eventually not passed because of a Democratic control of the Senate eventually. So I think those are important things to consider. Moving beyond, I think, kind of domestic and more internationally, to look at Trump's foreign policy with Latin America, I think it's very important to look at the types of individuals he will likely put in foreign policy positions. And the names that have come up are individuals like former Ambassador Bolton, which Bill mentioned, and then Newt Gingrich, who was the former Speaker of the House from the state of Georgia. These individuals are fairly conservative and have very well-connected networks with American multinationals, and that leads me to believe a couple things are possible. The United States has frankly had a very extractive relationship with Latin America for the past 80 years. We've seen CIA involvement in Latin America, in Chile, in Guatemala, in a number of situations that have had horrible effects in Latin American countries, often for the benefit of United States multinational corporations. I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see that type of activity in place, especially if we have these types of appointments for our Central Intelligence Agency. That's one bucket. Two, Mr. Trump has made comments about trying to stand up against strongmen in Latin America. He said this directly about Venezuela, and there is fear that there could be some sort of intervention in Latin American countries on this ground. Knowing Mr. Gingrich's efforts in foreign policy, he's a very astute student of history, and a lot of these individuals really believe in the Monroe Doctrine, which is an American foreign policy belief founded by President James Monroe in the early 19th century, that Latin America is effectively the backyard of the United States, and no other region should have any say other than the United States. We've seen China and other regions begin to heavily invest in Latin America as a kind of a resource race. I could see those tensions becoming very, very dangerous and causing further degradation of relations, not only with Latin America, but with other global powers, as we kind of have these proxy battles for the United States as it transitions from a true global superpower to more of a regional power. And we can talk about maybe that later on and the multipolarity of the world, but I think it's safe to say with the election of Trump, the United States is going to only accelerate its decrease as the lone superpower in the world.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That's terrific. I think that emphasis, particularly on the people who may be there in the foreign policy team. Well, we don't know yet. We won't know for some time. But if it were people like Bolton and Gingrich, the important point that Jonathan has emphasized, I think, is correctly, is that these are not isolationists. These are internationalists of a form that is, however, particular, shall we say, as it were, not in line with, if you like, the liberal international order that we know it. Newt Gingrich, just as an aside, was one of the most frequent American letter writers to The Economist in the 1980s for some reason. They were always getting letters from this strange character. So he was an internationalist reader of such things, but with his, as you say, is absolutely his own agenda and his own ideas. And John Bolton is absolutely in that front. Now let's open to short, sharp contributions from the floor, and by all means ask all of us questions. This is a situation in which we are all in a state of wonderment and mystery. So we are all together. Who would like to start? In the front here, come on. Let's kick off, and no, go here and then to the lady, yeah.
Right, but on the international front, what do people think about the seeming contradiction between Trump's non-interventionist stance and the declared intention to bomb ISIS, to take aggressive military steps like that? I mean, there seems to be a huge problem there. If he did that, it implies conflict with Russia. On the other hand, he's made overtures toward Russia.
Well, personally, just to answer that quickly, I think we should remember that George W. Bush, his slogan was, let's be humble but strong. And that didn't last very long. So I think that when presidents meet reality, they get tested. And my guess is that we should believe the bombing ISIS more than the non-intervention. Myself, just because I think he's an actor. He's someone who wants to show he's doing things. But your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I'm not sure that he would bomb ISIS if he didn't have an agreement with the Pentagon about what was the point that he was trying to do. So he will be in the hands of the Pentagon in that. But nevertheless, he's likelier to be a hard power man, in my view.
He's already made it clear that he knows quite a bit more than the generals on that. So.
Well, yeah, sure, about everything. Yeah, please.
Well, Trump has. I'd like to speak on the Middle East and perhaps ask if you have any insights on the Middle Eastern foreign policy. he has mentioned that he'd, this divisive, explosive claim that he'd moved the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And we also know that his Middle East advisor is a former Lebanese militiaman. But other than that, would you expect a disengagement from the region, allowing Russia, the upper hand in Syria and the region, basically?
Anyone got a view on that on the panel? Jonathan?
So, I mean, it's interesting you talk about that. I mean, from the very start, Mr. Trump has said he would have not gone into Iraq in the first place. That was a very often quoted charge against Jeb Bush as criticism of his brother, the former president. So, on one level, he doesn't want to get involved in quote-unquote nation building. And on another level, the types of policies he wants to pursue are really not, it's odd that I'm going to say this, but they're not as different from, say, President Obama's we saw in the Libya situation. He's willing to have airstrikes and that kind of, attacks from afar, but he's very unwilling to put boots on the ground. And I think honestly, it actually is some sort of a cohesive strategy on his part. It's at least coherent from what I think he's trying to do. He doesn't want to put boots on the ground. He wants to attack from far. He wants to basically increase intelligence and then rely on other nations in the region to start picking up the flack when it comes to manpower and those types of resources.
And that's not very out of line with some recent presidents. I mean, that's Bill Clinton in his first 5 years, basically,
right.
Or several years anyway, basically. So that wouldn't be so different. And on disengagement, I'd just add, and Ferry, you come in. I do think that he will not wish to treat dealing with the Middle East as a priority in his first 12 months. He's not, if he can avoid it. Important question.
Yeah, on Syria and Islamic State, he made on several occasions clear, I think, it was an interview to New York Times, I believe, in August or September. So he said that we cannot fight both Islamic State and Assad. So we have to choose one, and I would choose IS. And if he chooses IS indeed, then there's a high possibility that he might cooperate with Russia on that. And it will maybe entrench Assad staying in power if IS will be defeated successfully. So,
yeah, that would be a reasonable thought. On Israel, clearly the Republican Congress is kind of, as it were, more like Netanyahu oriented than the Obama administration has been. So, how that's followed through is unpredictable, but the Republicans are important on that. Others? So.
Sorry, my question just kind of about how state leaders across the world should kind of correctly respond to Trump being president. I know in Ireland that the Prime Minister Enda Kenny has gotten kind of criticism for a sort of unconditioned congratulation on Donald Trump, having previously kind of condemned some of his rhetoric. And on the other hand, you have Angela Merkel having much more kind of conditioned congratulations. I hope we can work together. Also, don't forget about, all these values which you're meant to stand up for. I'm just wondering, what you think the appropriate response of state leaders is in terms of, this very first, because it's a fairly small issue, but it is the very first chance you have to kind of interact with Donald Trump. And how do you, kind of temper your congratulation, I guess?
You need a diplomat to answer that question, I think. My answer to that is that you've got to deal. All governments and all diplomats have to deal with the governments that are, rather than the governments that they would like to be there. So the congratulations is, I'm afraid, unavoidable. I would be in the Angela Merkel front. I haven't followed that distinction as in your detail, but I think putting some sort of a condition on it is a good idea. But about the agenda that you need to confront together. But I think all governments have to take the view that you're with him until they're proven to be against him. But meanwhile, they should be working on their own networks and their own alliances and their own strengths in order to be able to deal with the potential new world that we've been talking about, I think. Christian. Christine Melia, who's spent a career being diplomatic in the British Council.
but not going to talk about Europe, actually. I think it was Voltaire that said, if a man can convince you of absurdities, he can convince you to commit atrocities. And I just wonder, Jonathan alluded to it a bit about the aftermath, if the panel think that we're going to see some violence by Trump supporters who are rather emboldened by the result.
So domestic American violence, yes. Jonathan,
I
your
mean,
view on that?
we've already seen it. I mean, literally within hours of the election, there were riots in the street of my native California. We've seen increase of unprovoked attacks on individuals of both Muslim and Hispanic background. So a lot of individuals in the United States unfortunately feel empowered that because Trump has won, this, to borrow Nixonian terminology, silent majority is again within control of America. And they've taken America back is oftentimes the type of talk you hear. So, who have they taken it back from? They've taken it back, frankly, from people who look like me, people who are minorities, people who are the immigrants themselves or the descendants of immigrants. So, unfortunately, I think you are going to see an uptick of violence. It's my hope that this subsides for the sake of the Republic, but there are organized protests that have been taken under the form of "Not My President." It's the rallying cry that we've seen in major U.S. cities since Tuesday evening.
Right at the back, and then we'll come into the front here. Yes. Sorry. Yep. Okay. I've looked now.
Hi. So, what does the recent US election and Brexit before it mean for institutions like the Blavatnik School? I think that it's fairly safe to say that most members of the Blavatnik School are certainly horrified by the results of the election and didn't expect to see what happened in the Brexit vote. And I think that asks questions about how elite institutions and policy-oriented and government-orientated academia and sort of think tanks, how they're composed, who they speak to, who they include, in a sense, in their discussions. And I wonder whether these events have already provoked some soul searching within such institutions.
Okay, very good. Well, we'll just keep that for a moment and come back to it, because that's an excellent broad question. I'll just come to the front here and then over there.
Two short questions on Europe. One, in the short term, you mentioned French and German elections coming up, but before that we have the Italian referendum. Do you think there might be any effect there? And secondly, someone must ask a question about Brexit. Is it going to affect Brexit in any way?
Okay, let's get a third question and then we'll answer those three. Yeah, between us. Please, no, please ask. What was it again? I couldn't hear.
Mine was more of a contribution to the perspective of Latin America. So.
Oh, no, go ahead. Give your contribution. Go on.
Yeah.
Let's hear it. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out a little aspects, specifically on the foreign policy. And I think Mexico is going to play a very key role. Trump has said that the way to finance the wall, it will be paid initially by the U.S. With contributions, and then Mexico is going to have to pay it back, probably through taxes and tariffs to importation. But I think Mexico also will play an important role because it already is playing an important role in protection of human rights of migrants in the route to the U.S. Because when the U.S. went through their child migrant crisis, it put a lot of pressure on Mexico to be their watchdog, and actually we saw that children arriving to the U.S. declined, but deportation and detention of children in Mexico was the actual compensation. And then I think that also in the other aspect, I don't know what you think of in relation to China's intervention in Latin America, particularly in Nicaragua, where they're trying to build a second canal. And that involves climate change, climate change, human rights, and trade.
So
And finally, yeah.
No, go on.
And also, like, I think the other focus will be Colombia's peace accord, not in the sense of peace for Colombia, but rather because FARC is not only a guerrilla, but also a very strong drug trafficker or money launderer for Latin America. So they'll probably, the U.S. government will want to push for a harder deal, a more difficult deal, and that might affect the actual, feasibility of it.
Thank you. Let's take the one behind, just behind it.
Thank you. My question is about the young voters. There were discussions, and there's been a bit of back and forth, but I think generally they voted for the Democrats in the last election, and then of course with Brexit we saw that the young people would have generally voted to stay in. How do we keep their vision alive and keep them empowered and keep them in the discussion?
Okay, let's look at those four questions between us on the panel. Maybe let's start with the European one, and then we'll... do you have a thought about what it means for Brexit and for other European political events, including the Italian referendum? I'll say something.
Yeah, I think what it does is emboldens parties within Europe that want to leave Europe. So within European states, it says that it's okay to be isolationist and nationalistic, and we should bring home control of. And I think that is important. That this isn't just the extreme right and no one's listening to them. I think that now they can hold positions of power in the most important and most powerful position in the world. I'm not sure exactly how it is going to affect Brexit. I think, given that TTIP doesn't look like it's going to happen, there are now bigger concerns for the free market, so I think it'll definitely affect it, the actual negotiations.
So I would say, just adding on that, I mean, you could say on Brexit, we're no longer going to be back at the queue of trade deals. The question is whether there'll be a queue. But if there's a queue, then we will be much further up it than we previously were. So in some ways, for the Liam Foxes of this world, it's good. But what kind of trade deal could Britain do with a free trade skeptic US president and administration would be the big question. I think that for Brexit, it doesn't really change it all that much, but it would increase the political salience of a continued strong relationship with the rest of Europe. And I think the voices who say, let's go too far from our European friends when we've got this unpredictability on the other side of the Atlantic, will get a bit stronger as a result of this. Italy, I doubt if it'll have much of a direct effect on the Italian referendum, but it might slightly swing people back to supporting Renzi and the vote, I would suggest, because of the kind of the sense of the what uncertainty can bring, and the uncertainty in Italy is the five-star movement and a potential general election, and then, as it were, a new unpredictable. So Renzi, you might like him or not, but you know who he is. So that would be my guess, but I don't really know. Institutions like BSG and other like liberal establishment. Any views? Farid, we need to try harder and win the argument.
About BSG?
Yeah, about BSG and similar liberal institutions, if you like.
How it's going to influence?
Yeah, do we need? Does this mean that we've all lost, or does it mean that we need to work harder?
No, I think it actually was a good opportunity for institutions like BSG and other liberal, let's say, institutions with a liberal mindset. I think we finally received maybe a wake-up call, and the fact that a personality such as like Donald Trump became a president of the United States, of a global power, should be rather viewed as a possibility maybe to review our worldview, to understand the reasons why this happened and what should we do in order to prevent it in the future. Because at the end of the day, I think that the president in the United States is more about the office than the personality in the first place. Yes, personality matters definitely, but it's mostly, unlike maybe many other countries in the world, it's mostly about the office, and it's mostly about the institution. But the major fear is that these institutions might be changed, perhaps, or might be somehow hurted, damaged. And the main point is not to let that happen, even when a person such as Donald Trump is in charge of those institutions, not institutions, but has a position in those institutions. And eventually, like maybe in 4 years or in 8 years, when he will cease to become a president, of course, we should not make the same mistakes again and maybe contribute to educating people around the globe, contribute to setting maybe agenda to generate ideas in order to become more conscious of things of negative things that may happen in our society.
Young voters. Any thoughts on my left here about the engagement of young voters and what if anything this result should tell us?
I think when it comes to young voters and when you see such an extreme result in any election, I personally think it's a good thing because it allows a generation to see the ramifications or what happens when you kind of don't really dabble in politics or have a consistent ideological point of view in politics. So it's a great wake-up call. And it also kind of tells you that democracy, elections, participating in these processes, institutions, while these are things we take for granted, these are also not things that you just pass by or, just be a blank participant in. You also need to kind of work within these processes if you want your point of view, if you want your opinion to have a voice in it. So again, electoral cycles, politics evolve. What happened 15 years ago is probably not going to happen 15 years later. But for people who are young and people who are interested in politics, I think right now they may feel a little out of it or left, on the fringe. But the point is to still be actively participating in it and have point of views and try to persuade others to your ideology, whatever that is, as long as it's credible and as long as you genuinely believe in it.
Yes, please.
I think that maybe this is a wake-up call, because in Brexit, obviously, the statistics show, and in the US elections, that the young people were voting for the other side. And maybe this is a wake-up call, and young people will stop just sharing posts on their Facebook feeds about their political ideals and actually maybe go out and talk to the older generation about their views. I'm Irish, so during the marriage equality referendum 2 years ago, the whole campaign realised that the young people were always going to vote yes for marriage equality, but the much older generation, which are quite religious in Ireland, they weren't going to be on board. So we had a whole campaign saying you have to go talk to your granny, talk to your granddad, and about why they should vote yes for equal gay rights. And it was a very, very successful campaign, and we now have equal marriage rights in Ireland. So I think that hopefully young people will learn from that and will change their strategies for campaigning.
It's all to play for, basically. Now I've got to bring it to an end. You want to say something very quickly?
Yeah, just as a young liberal American voter, I think you look at the map of if just under 40s had voted, it would have been overwhelmingly Clinton. But I think what we also saw in this election was that education was also a party line in this case. So if you look at whites under 40, it was without a college education, it was overwhelmingly Republican. So I think the other wake-up call for young voters is that the narrative of hope and change that we thought this grassroots, past 8 years, 10 years of campaigning with Obama had changed the discourse and changed the landscape of politics. I think the young voters have to be aware that that narrative left other young voters out, and it made them feel isolated in our current political system. So to avoid another divisive election, I think that narrative of hope and change that we kind of ran with the banner for the past 8 years, we have to figure out a way to bring the rest of the young voters back into the fold.
Thank you. Well, we're absolutely positive. We need to carry on the argument and the fight. I have run out of time today, but we are reconvening, at least we, the Blavatnik School, is reconvening on the 16th of November with an evening discussion reflecting upon the US election. So please come to that, share your views on that, and we'll have another week of thought and maybe even some news, but probably not, to illuminate us. So thank you, Jonathan, Fareed, Ali, and Sarah. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very good.